Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be exploring the early years of the jazz fusion band Weather Report. I've always felt that those early years are not that well represented by the albums that came out. There's some incredible music on there, but live the band were doing so much more and was so much more fiery. On this video I'm going to be going through the early history up until around 1977, but also I'm going to be stitching together a psychedelic visual and oral pastiche of Weather Report at that time to sort of bring out how otherworldly, wild and psychedelic this band was. So this video has two intentions. One is to impart information, but another is to explore this aspect that is probably best represented on the live album Live in Tokyo. But I don't feel we really know what that band was like, and in some cases there were units going out on tour, especially around about 1975 when they went out on tour with the drummers Greg Errico and Dean Brown, drummers that never made an album. So it's an interesting period to get into. So much discussion is about the Jaco Pastorius era, but I hope you enjoy this video. Sit back and relax. It won't be one of my normal videos. There's going to be a lot going on, so I hope you enjoy this video. In 1977, the jazz fusion band Weather Report brought out an album called Heavy Weather. On it was the hit single Birdland. This album went on to become one of jazz's biggest selling albums, and by 1991 it had sold over 1 million copies. Weather Report were one of the dominant jazz fusion bands of the 1970s. Their career lasted from 1970 to 1986. Throughout that period, they released a whole host of albums that ranged from quite avant-garde jazz to catchy, accessible tunes and melodies. The band was formed by Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinul, two monster musicians of the jazz scene who had already established themselves by the time they came to form Weather Report in 1970. In this video, I'm going to explore the history of this band. We will be going through the many albums that they made and the many musicians that have played in this band. So sit back and let's enjoy the weather. Joseph Zawinul was born on the 7th of July 1932. He was born in Austria and grew up in Vienna. By the time he'd reached the age of 8 or 9, Austria was under Nazi occupation, and he grew up within the horrors of the war that surrounded him. If you look into his early years, he had quite a few traumatic experiences, including childhood friends being blown up and having to discover their bodies in the rubble. I think this created a tough exterior with Joe Zawinul. From an early age, he had studied the accordion, and also he played the clarinet, the violin and the piano. And this led him to the Vienna Conservatory, where he studied classical music. By the time the 1950s arrived, he had got an interest in jazz, and he started to play with local jazz musicians in Austria. He also became the staff pianist for Polydor Records. So he was quite a recognised musician in his own country. But his love of jazz took him to the United States of America in 1959, where he attended Berklee College. But his talents were obvious, and on arrival in the United States of America, very quickly he was picked up by the band leader Maynard Ferguson and joined his band in 1959. Wayne Shorter was born a year after Joe Zawinul on August the 25th in 1933. He grew up in Newark, New Jersey. Like Joe Zawinul, he also studied the clarinet as a young boy and later on moved to the tenor saxophone And in 1952, he enrolled at New York University to study music. A little known fact about Joe Zawinul is he had another jazz playing brother, Alan Shorter, born the year before him, and went on to be a free jazz trumpet player in the 1960s and 70s. After leaving college in 1956, Wayne Shorter joined the army, where he got to play with Horace Silver. But after his discharge in 1959, he was also asked to play in the Maynard Ferguson Big Band, and in that band, he met Joe Zawinul. This was 11 years before the formation of Weather Report. In the 1960s, both Shorter and Zawinul found fame in various bands. For Wayne Shorter, he was part of the classic Second Great Quintet that Miles Davis formed in the early 60s, which also included Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, and Tony Williams. In that band, he submitted a number of compositions and established himself as not only one of the greatest saxophone players in jazz at that time, but also one of its best composers. Joe Zawinul went on to join Cannonball Adderley's band and established himself as one of the best jazz pianists around. He also moved to electric piano at this time and wrote the jazz standard Mercy, Mercy, Mercy. In 1969, Joe Zawinul joined Wayne Shorter in Miles Davis's group. At this time, Miles Davis was moving towards a style of music that could be described as electric jazz, and laying the groundworks for what would become jazz rock fusion. Zawinul came in and played on the classic album In a Silent Way, not only contributing electric piano, but also contributing the composition In a Silent Way. And he went on to play on the landmark Bitches Brew album in 1970. By this time, Shorter and Zawinul realised that they had a certain musical chemistry together. But the origination of Weather Report does not actually start with Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinul, like many people believe. The great classically trained Czech-born bass player Miroslav Vitaz had also been jamming with Wayne Shorter. He was already known for his work with Herbie Mann, Bob Brookmeyer, Stan Getz and Chick Corea. And it was Miroslav Vitaz who suggested they form a band with Wayne Shorter. And it was around this time that Wayne Shorter suggested they bring in Joe Zawinul. And so what we have in 1970 is the beginnings of Weather Report, not built around two virtuoso musicians, but actually three, who were all coming in as composers. And that was Wayne Shorter, Joe Zawinul, and Miroslav Vitous. They decided to bring in a very young up-and-coming drummer called Alphonse Mouzon that had made a name for himself in Mulcahy Tyner's band. And on percussion, they brought in the great Don Elias and an orchestral percussionist, Barbara Burton. When they went into the studio to record their debut album, which was self-titled, sparks began to fly between Don Elias and Joe Zawinul. Don Elias objecting to the sort of dictatorial approach that Joe Zawinul had, something that would emerge as the band went on, and was probably the fundamental reason why so many musicians went through this band. Don Elias was gone, and so they brought in the innovative Brazilian percussionist Airto Moreira, who had also been playing with Miles Davis at that time. They thought it would be wise to bring in a guitarist, and of course John McLaughlin was making waves in the Miles Davis band, at least on the recordings at that time. But John McLaughlin turned them down in order to form the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and actually asked Miroslav Vitous if there was any keyboardist that he knew of, and it was Miroslav Vitous that then suggested his friend from back in Czechoslovakia, Jan Hammer, to come in. And so it's quite interesting how the two formative jazz fusion bands of the 1970s are intertwined in their formation right back in 1970-71. I think it would be useful from now on to look at the history of this band in terms of the albums that they released, starting with their self-titled album Weather Report that was released on May the 12th, 1971 by Columbia Records. In this way, I think it will give somebody who wants to have a deeper understanding of the history of this band a way of understanding the incredible amount of musicians that went through this group, and also how they contributed or didn't to various albums, and see how the band evolved from what started off as quite an avant-garde free electric jazz group and ended up as one of the biggest jazz groups in the world. The debut album seems to extend the approach that Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinul had contributed to on the Miles Davis albums In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew. This album subdued the mood even more and really eschewed solo improvisation for a sort of collective approach to improvisation that went back to the early years of jazz in New Orleans. When you look at the credits on the album, we can see it's credited to Joe Zawinul on electric and acoustic piano, Wayne Shorter on soprano saxophone. He'd made a move on these albums away from tenor saxophone, and it was the sound of the soprano saxophone that really gave Weather Report a signature sound, especially Wayne Shorter's soprano saxophone that sounds like nobody else playing soprano saxophone. We see Miroslav Vitous on acoustic bass and electric bass, Alphonse Mouzon on drums and voice, and Airto Moreira on percussion, but not credited on this album is Don Elias and Barbara Burton on additional percussion. This album received a good deal from Columbia Records through Clive Davis and a big push. And although there was a big marketing campaign behind this album and it received 5-star reviews, it didn't really set the world alight. And I find going back to this album that it's a little bit introverted and unsure of itself, and it seems like it's a band trying to find its way, but also hitting a whole bunch of personnel problems with this band that was supposed to be set up as a supergroup. By the time we get to the second album, I Sing the Body Electric in 1972, most of these musicians have gone, and we are just left with Miroslav Vitous, Wayne Shorter, and Joe Zawinul. But before they went into the studio to record the second album, they actually recorded a live album in Japan on January the 13th, 1972. This album went on to be a Japanese-only release and didn't see a worldwide release until it came out on CD in 2014. This album, live in Tokyo, shows a completely new band, re-energized and a lot more muscular in its approach. Alphonse Mouzon has been replaced by the great Eric Gravatt, and Ayetu has gone and is replaced by Don Ramayo. What we hear on this album is much more stronger, muscular versions of some of the tracks that we heard on the first album, plus some new compositions and some compositions that went back to Wayne Shorter's time with Miles Davis. What's interesting about this is these recordings actually went on to form side 2 of their album I Sing the Body Electric. I often wonder why they did this and only went back into the studio to record a small number of songs for side 1 of this album. But I think that I Sing the Body Electric is a great improvement on the first album and really shows their through compositional approach coming to the fore. Whilst Weather Report were making these esoteric electric jazz albums, the Mahavishnu Orchestra had emerged with their debut album, and by 1972 they were touring the world and changing the face of jazz rock. This muscular, much more heavy rock, Hendrix, prog approach to jazz fusion must have had an influence on Weather Report. We definitely hear them amping up and getting louder, but I often wonder whether the band was a little bit unfocused at this time. What we do hear on I Sing the Body Electric is Joe Zawinul taking the reins a little bit more. His opening 8-minute Unknown Soldier for me surpasses anything on the debut album. It tells a story of somebody growing up in a village like Joe Zawinul grew up in Europe, going out to war, and you hear the horrors of war, and then he returns back home and you hear the echoes of the trauma in the music as he returns home. There's incredible use of guest musicians on this album, because we have a whole host of extra musicians on here. I feel that the vocals of Yolanda Bevin, Josh Armstrong and Chapman Roberts are incredible on track 1, giving it an almost ghostly quality. Ralph Towner's 12-string guitar on the track The Moors is also a revelation. And we also get on here Andrew White on English horn, Hubert Laws on flute on track 1. We've got Roger Powell coming in and programming up Zawinul's ARP synthesizer. So this is the first time we see Zawinul moving to playing a synthesizer on a record. There is a slow development happening on these albums as they move towards their own signature sound. Snotty jazz fans love these albums very much because they're more avant-garde and more challenging. But I actually think these albums are unfocused. And as we plot our way through, we see them moving towards a signature sound, which would make Weather Report the legends that we see them as now. Weather Report went back in the studio in April 1973, and after a week of recordings, they came up with their third album, Sweetnighter. By this time, jazz fusion was in full flow, but Joe Zawinul, who had taken more control over the band even than before, brought in a new style of music. He, along with Billy Cobham and then later Herbie Hancock, brought funk beats and grooves into this sound. It must also be said that Miles Davis was exploring a similar approach to this at the same time. This is the point where we see jazz rock move from being a sort of heavy rock, proggy style of music to a much more funkier style of music. And with the funk and groove, there is the promise of selling some records. But although this album features some incredibly heavy funk grooves, it is also recorded in the same improvisational style that we see on the earlier albums. The tracks Boogie Woogie Waltz and 125th Street Congress and Non-Stop Home, the last track on the album, are incredibly funky. And of course, in true Weather Report style, they'd lost their bass player and drummer. Tension in the band had caused Miroslav Vitous to leave. At the time, Zawinul cited that he was playing too much acoustic bass and playing it with a bow too much, and actually questioned his intonation in playing in that way. Andrew White, who played English horn on the first album, was also brought in to play English horn, but also contributed electric bass to 4 of the tracks. Eric Gravatt is still there, but I think by the time this album was finished, he'd gone. And we also see the much funkier Herschel Dwellingham coming in to play on 4 of the tracks. Dom Omaramo is still on percussion and plays some flute, but we also get Maruga Buka playing Moroccan clay drums and various percussion instruments across the album. This album is often seen as being a sort of interim album, and I don't think that's fair. I actually think this is an incredibly groundbreaking album, and some of the grooves seem to be laying the foundations for rap and hip-hop many years later. This is perhaps Weather Report's first masterpiece. And what we hear, rather than being an interim album, is we hear the joint between their much more funkier approach and the sort of collective avant-garde improvisational approach that we saw on the early albums. With the departure of Eric Gravatt, probably in a bit of a mood because they brought in Herschel Dwellingham to play some of the funkier beats on this album, did not mean that Herschel Dwellingham was around to carry on playing. And believe it or not, in 1973 they brought in the 3rd drummer that they'd approached in this year. The drummer Greg Errico, that had formerly played in the band Sly and the Family Stone, and it is Greg Errico who played on the Sweetnighter tour. But after that tour, he did not stay in the band. In later years, Joe Zawinul would describe Eric Gravatt as the greatest of the pure jazz drummers that had worked in Weather Report. But the truth was, the bringing in of Herschel Dwellingham onto the Sweetnighter album was a sign that Joe Zawinul was moving in a different direction. The arguments that had emerged between Miroslav Vitous and Joe Zawinul were all based around the future of the band and the creative potential of the band. Miroslav Vitous wanted to record in the original, much more avant-garde and expressionist style, and after he left the band, he did just this, releasing albums on the ECM label. He too is eventually replaced by the much funkier Alphonso Johnson. It seems quite obvious that Zawinul was listening to a lot of the popular music forms around at that time and wanted to move Weather Report in that direction. It is these ideas that infused the next album that came out in 1974, which was called Mysterious Traveller. But the split between Miroslav Vitous and Joe Zawinul remained acrimonious. Miroslav Vitous suspected that there was foul play at work in his ejection from the band and described Joe Zawinul as a first-class manipulator. The quiet and withdrawn Wayne Shorter was stuck in between these two egos, and he had to make a decision, and his decision was to side with Wayne Shorter. Of course, their friendship went back much further, and there was definitely a certain chemistry between these two musicians, but also Zawinul had a vision, and once Miroslav Vitous had gone and he went off to join ECM Records, where he could pursue his much more esoteric and expressionist approach to music, Weather Report went about releasing their 4 greatest albums, starting with Mysterious Traveller, followed up by the underrated Tales Spinning, and then perhaps what is their finest album creatively, Black Market, which was followed up with the aforementioned Heavy Weather in 1977, And by this point, the success of these albums had moved Weather Report into an arena-filling group that toured the world almost as if they were a rock band in front of screaming fans, with huge record sales, television appearances and festival appearances all over the world. Mysterious Traveller is one of their greatest albums, and in my opinion it's only marred by a slightly muddy production, which is quite surprising for Weather Report. The session drummer that was brought in to do the Sweetnighter tour, Greg Errico, has gone, and they now have Ishmael Wilburn on drums. His drumming on the opening Nubian Sundance is absolutely incredible. We still see the echoes of the Vita Zawinul collaboration on the second track, American Tango. But by this point, Miroslav is obviously gone, replaced by Alphonso Johnson, that brings a really funky and virtuoso approach to the electric bass, something that I think was key to the success of Weather Report. Without having a guitar player, that aspect of someone stood at the front of the stage moving around as a guitar hero had to be filled by a bass player, and Alphonso Johnson was an incredible bass player. He was also an early adopter of the Chapman stick, and he was actually playing the Chapman stick on some of the gigs around this time. Ishmael Wilburn and Alphonso Johnson formed the groove to one of their funkiest tracks, which is Cucumber Slumber, which finishes out side one. This is a really fantastic album, which I think is great because of Joe Zawinul's tightening of the reins. The compositions are much more tighter. Rather than having this collective improvisational approach, the solos are used in a much more architectural compositional approach. This is something that Weather Report, I think, took from Duke Ellington. Solos appear as part of the composition. They don't necessarily solo over the form, but they just act as one other aspect in Zawinul or Shorter's vision. As we carry on through this catalogue, we see the incredible compositions that are coming both from Joe Zawinul and Wayne Shorter. On this album, we see that Nubian Sundance was written by Zawinul, as was Cucumber Slumber, and obviously the bass line coming from Alphonso Johnson. Whereas Mysterious Traveller, which I think is the best composition on this album, was written by Wayne Shorter, as was Blackthorn Rose. This is a fantastic album. Again, Weather Report went out on tour, and by the end of that tour, they had lost their drummer, and in this case, also lost Dom Umramaro on percussion. Joe Zawinul later said that Ishmael Wilburn sort of lost heart on that tour, and they actually brought in another drummer, Darryl Brown, to play alongside him. But by the tour was finished, both Darryl Brown and Ishmael Wilburn had gone, and with the departure of Dom Umramaro, Weather Report again found themselves drummerless. All that was there was Joe Zawinul, Wayne Shorter and Alphonso Johnson. And so pretty quickly they need to locate another drummer and percussionist for the next album. They decided to go for the session drummer Ndugu Leon Chancellor, who was brought in on a strictly session drumming basis for the next album, Tell Spinning, and they also brought in the percussionist Alero Lima. This album, Tell Spinning, came out in 1975, and I believe it is one of their greatest albums. I think it was influenced quite deeply by what was going on in the jazz fusion scene around. And in terms of soloing and burning playing and just letting loose, I think this is their greatest album. There seems to be a real chemistry with this band, which is a shame because obviously Ndugu being brought in on a session basis meant that he wasn't going to stick around for the following tour. Alphonso Johnson brought in his friend Chester Thompson that was playing with Frank Zappa's band at the time. Frank Zappa had brought Chester Thompson in to play alongside Ralph Humphrey in that band. He was brought in to bring in more firepower and perhaps a little bit of that sort of jazz fusion approach that Billy Cobham had made famous in the Mahavishnu Orchestra. With the addition of Chester Thompson, perhaps the band would now be more stable, but actually we see a whole bunch of musicians leaving. Eliro Lima stayed around long enough to play uncredited percussion on the following album, Black Market, but pretty soon he was gone, and they went back to Don Elias, who was the original choice for Weather Report's percussionist back right in the early days, who had already had a problem with Joe Zawinul's dictatorial approach. Joe Zawinul had assumed that Chester Thompson would leave when Alphonso Johnson, worn out by playing alongside all these different drummers, decided to move when he had an offer for Billy Cobham to join the Billy Cobham George Duke band. With Alphonso Johnson going, but Chester Thompson still saying, there's more confusion happened as Joe Zawinul then brought in Narada Michael Walden, who had been playing with Jeff Beck and with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. With Alphonso Johnson going, Narada then suggested to Joe Zawinul that he should try out the bass player Jaco Pastorius. The addition of Jaco Pastorius to the band absolutely revitalised the Weather Report. This was because of a number of reasons, not only because of his incredible virtuoso approach to the bass, but also he came in as a third composer, and also his charisma as almost a rock star in the band was able to provide a focus that Weather Report had not had before. The importance of Jaco Pastorius in Weather Report cannot be overestimated, and I feel that the only way I can do that justice is to perhaps do a separate video where I look at Weather Report's Jaco Pastorius years. And so this video I am now going to draw to an end, and I hope this has been an enjoyable voyage through the early years of Weather Report. If you want to see part 2, please like and subscribe, and put in the comments that you enjoyed this and you want to hear a little bit more about the history of this incredible band. Please remember I have a Patreon, and you can support me there, and the links are in the description of this video. And if you would like to give me a financial tip, I also have a link to my PayPal tip jar. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you, or at least you will hear me, on the next one. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that exploration into the early years of Weather Report. When you make videos like this, it's interesting how it enlightens you, and you learn more by the end of it, you know, by sort of seeing it in an aesthetic way. When I started to pull the imagery together, the first imagery I went for was imagery of Austria, and that conjured in my mind a whole bunch of different scenes. For a start, you had the idea of Vienna, which is quite a cosmopolitan town. Then you have the idea of war-torn Austria, occupied by the Nazis. But there's also in Joe Zawinul's music an allusion to a sort of folk music forms, which takes you back to quite an ancient idea of mountain people, small villages, ancient rituals and pastimes that were happening in Eastern Europe, perhaps influenced by sort of Romany culture. It's a very interesting thing. And then from that you see this journey that Joe Zawinul makes to America, to New York, and that's another thing, especially with those album covers that Weather Report released, like Heavy Weather, where you feel that sort of an American cityscape, very cosmopolitan, almost the opposite of that. There's also African influences in there, especially African music, the world music, and those sort of rituals, the idea of a procession, the idea of a carnival, which takes us to South America, Brazil, and all those types of things are all contained. And it was quite interesting looking at it. I start to think, well, can I bring in Asian influences? And then you see they're there as well. Weather Report really did pull from all aspects of all music all over the world. And and were able to take all those influences and stitch them together, but have a sound that was uniquely their own. And I think when we look at a band that did not have a stable lineup, that existed, you know, with these roll call of different drummers and percussionists and bass players, and every now and then certain musicians would, you know, come into the band that would have a little bit of a special place. I think Miroslav Vitos obviously at the beginning, Jaco Pastorius in the middle, and then towards the end, the last few years of the 1980s, it seems to just become Zawinul and Shorter's show, and even Shorter slowly gets pushed out of the limelight. But through all of that, there's a certain sound that we associate with Weather Report, and I think it's the sound of improvisation between Joe Zawinul and Wayne Shorter. I think that's the key to all of this. I remember watching, when I was a kid, a video called Domino Theory, which came out in the early 80s when they'd first re-emerged with the Omar Hakim Victor Bailey band. And in the midst of that, there was a sort of live improvisation. Now, of course, Weather Report would do this quite a lot in the old days, but there was a improvisation between keyboards and Wayne Shorter. And it was obviously completely free improvised, but it wasn't free jazz. But there again, it could be as avant-garde as it wanted to be, but as simplistic as it wanted to be as well, and very direct. And I think there was an incredible chemistry between Zawinul and Shorter, which I think is the sound of Weather Report. I think that is it embodied. And I'm pretty sure that if you were to put Shorter and Zawinul in a studio and you got them to just basically improvise for 40 minutes and then orchestrated that to the correct rhythm sections with the correct stuff going on, you would have the sound of Weather Report. And I'm pretty sure that's what it was. And I think what happened is in the early days it was completely improvised, and they were working with musicians that were not quite their peers, because Zawinul and Wayne Shorter were that 10 years older than everybody else that was involved in the jazz rock fusion scene in the 70s. It's quite interesting, I think. They sort of have a direct link back to the jazz that was happening in the 50s. You know, they're almost like contemporaries of Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane. But there's a futuristic-ness to them. And I think when they start off, they've sort of got that generation below them, but as they carry on, they move towards a point where they're almost like father figures to the people below them, and in that they sort of, then there's a little bit of a power play that happens, and they gain control. Anyway, just thought I'd put a little bit on the end of the video just to make it close to one of my normal videos. I've got to go now, so I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one.